How do you say your last name? Is it Lubbers, Lubbers? Like, how do you?
Well, I'm going to Germany tomorrow, so it'll be Lubbers over there. But over here it's Lubbers.
Lubbers. Okay. I just want to make sure, I didn't want to get it wrong.
It's okay.
This podcast of the Bourbon Pursuit is sponsored by the folks at thewhiskeywash.com, a lifestyle website for people who always make sure they have whiskey in their life. Not because it gives them style, but because it gives them life. Thewhiskeywash.com.
And we're back with another episode of the Bourbon Pursuit podcast. My name is Kenny, and I've got Ryan here with me also. Ryan, how you doing?
Good, man. I'm super excited today. We're here at Heaven Hill's marketing and sales department. Probably everyone knows I'm a Heaven Hill fanboy, so I'm really excited to be here and talk to Bernie and learn more about the Heaven Hill brands and let everybody else know what's going on with them.
Yeah, I know. We already told you we're not gonna make it the focus of it, but we've gotta touch on it, right? So we've gotta talk about the Elijah Craig age statement dropping off because it's kind of the hot news that was, I don't even call it leaked out, but Fred Minnick kind of hinted on it a few weeks ago. So we'll kind of get some information on that. So let's go ahead and we'll kick it off and introduce our guest. So today we have Bernie Lubbers. Bernie is the man known as the Whiskey Professor, and he's currently residing as the brand ambassador for Heaven Hill. So Bernie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, good to see y'all.
Yeah. So I guess before we kind of talk about your job and stuff like that, we always have the typical question we got to ask. So tell us, how did you get into bourbon? Like, what was that kind of
that first bottle,
that defining moment?
Like bourbon in general, like growing up, or in the industry?
How did it influence you? Like,
growing up in Kentucky is a big influence. And my dad worked at Fall City Brewing Company here in Louisville, Kentucky for 45 years. And my grandfather was one of the original 13 saloon keepers that founded Fall City Brewing Company in 1905. So kind of grew up in a related industry. It was kind of neat. My dad would bring home these cool things that had Fall City on it. But I don't know, they were called today. We call them POS. But you don't know what that is when you're a kid. But it looked really interesting, and I never intended I was ever going to be in the business. But and my parents were both bourbon drinkers. My dad always drank bourbon. He obviously drank beer. They drank beer as well. But my mom and my dad both drank bourbon and beer. So that's something you notice growing up. We're Catholic, so it's part of the culture.
It's totally cool.
So you grow up around all that, and but that's also good. You get to see people, how they do it responsibly as well, and so that's something you're taught along the way. But and then I started doing stand-up comedy out of college. After about 3 years, I got out of college and had a real job there for a while. The comedy bug bit, and that was really in the mid 1980s when comedy was really exploding all over the country. So
that takes a lot of guts.
I took a chance, and I went out on the road and I started doing comedy and doing that. And so when you see, and back then there was not much bourbon in any, especially in a comedy clubs. The comedy clubs aren't known for
you
having
never got
big
hooked off stage or anything, right?
No, that's a whole different podcast and a whole different story. So, but so you notice things, and being from Kentucky, it's nice to have something that you can say. They go, oh, well, you make the bourbon or Kentucky Fried Chicken. There's a few things, the Kentucky Derby. So that was one of them because you're in a nightclub and talking to us. So anytime I would talk about my growing up and my family and that, and my dad was a big bourbon drinker. By the end of his life, he was drinking. In my act, I talked about he drank a quart of bourbon a day, which is what he told the doctor when the doctor asked him how much he drank. So it became a big closing part of my act, was talking about my 90-year-old dad who drank a quart of bourbon a day and had perfect health and all that stuff. So I'd always tell the folks in the crowd to order a shot of bourbon. And we're going to do a toast to my dad at the end of this routine here. So, and then I had a song I wrote about my dad, and we did the toast during the song. And it was really cool, and it became kind of a big part of my closing bit. And one of the folks at Jim Beam noticed that I was on stage talking to people and ordering bourbon from stage. Well, that's, a pretty big thing for a company if they're trying to get their brand into people's mouths. So, started. So they just invited me a lot of tastings, a lot of things. I got to be around them. A job became available. They asked me to interview for that job. I was doing events and promotions. It wasn't it was sort of like an ambassador job, but it was like just doing events and promotions for the different whiskey brands. And I started looking at it and presenting bourbon like a comedian would look at it, like, why are we talking about how we're making this stuff? That's not what I really want to hear about.
Right.
I just assumed you did that good. Why is every bourbon presentation, temperatures of when we drop the different grains and the fermenters and that? I mean, it's cool stuff, but this is for the average consumer. They want to hear the sexy stories. They want to hear
the parties,
all that stuff. I mean, the personalities, the Booker Knows and the Jimmy Russells and that's what they wanted to hear. I found a little niche to grab onto, which was words on labels. So I started teaching that just like a bottle of wine, you can learn a lot about that label if you read the label. So that kind of started putting my name. Like, he knows a little bit of, even though I wasn't an expert, but I found something.
Starts off as an expert.
You got to start somewhere, and that became something that no one else was talking about. So I started talking about words on labels, Kentucky Straight, bourbon whiskey, bottle and bond, age statements, things like that, things that meant something by law. And the brand manager for Knob Creek and the Small Batch, she liked that, and I started promoting. Then I became an ambassador and did that, and we expanded on that. And then spent several years at Jim Beam, and then the folks at Heaven Hill, their ambassador moved into a different role here, and they asked me if I would come over to Heaven Hill from Jim Beam, and it was made me a good offer.
There you go.
But I like the fact that going from a big corporation like Jim Beam, they make great whiskey, great brands. Hopefully some of my work is still being felt over there, but. Over here, it's family owned, and that was attractive to me. And the fact that the family was not only owned the company, but was involved with the company and ran the company. And we have a lot of brands over here that a larger company wouldn't have. We have a lot of bottle and bond brands, which is my passion and my little niche that I Old Granddad was one of my favorite. It was my first big favorite cool. Like 1985, 86,
I still love it.
We talked about it on a podcast.
Yeah.
We said, what's your favorite office bourbon that you always have at the office, something that you always have? And I always said, Old Granddad, bottle and bond. I'll keep it right there on my desk at the office. I
found that in Parma, Ohio, Drew Carey's backyard, when I was working up in Cleveland, and it was big up there. I didn't know anything about regions when you're working in comedy, but that was a big area for Old Granddad, and I've loved the bottle and bond since. And then I just always have. But over here we have so many bottle and bonds and so many cool old historic brands. It's like being in a little playground over here. So I really, really, I enjoyed my time at Jim Beam, and they have great stuff. But it's really fun over here, and the brands are just exciting, I think.
So you kind of talked about the bottle and bond piece, and you have your signature catchphrase or catch line, or what do you want to call it? So kind of tell the listeners, what's all that about?
Yeah, I have a book that I've written, and when I'll do book signings, I'll just sign it "Stay Bonded," Bernie Lubbers, and my card always has "Stay Bonded," everything, hashtag Stay Bonded, and that's thanks. Bottle and bond. If it wasn't for the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897, we'd all be drinking Seagram 7 today. Back then in the late 1800s, they were blending all this stuff together to make whiskey. Whiskey didn't have any laws. There was no consumer protection laws on anything. Mm-hmm. But when the Bottle and Bond Act came out, not before then they were just taking like neutral grain spirits, Everclear, if you will. Adding colors and flavors. If you've talked to Michael Veach, he's got recipes that they used to do where they used to add cherry juice, prune juice, tobacco juice, iodine for color, and then slap a whiskey label on it, and you're selling whiskey. Well, the manufacturers of the distillers of whiskey back then, they got together and they helped pass this law with John Carlisle, who was the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States at the time, the people that held the keys, the John E. Fitzgerald lore and all that stuff with the Treasury agents. And they passed this law. And so not only is it cool because it's the very first consumer protection legislation in the history of the United States, 9 years before we cared about the safe labeling of our food and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, we cared more about the quality of our whiskey. And I think that's another cool, historic tidbit that makes me love whiskey. And then bottle and bond. So bottle and bond, it's very restricted. So bourbon is very restricted. Scotch, is restricted. You have to make Scotch in Scotland. That's pretty restricted. It comes from one place. It's distilled up to pretty high proofs. You can distill Scotch up fairly high proof. You can add colors, caramel coloring to Scotch. So even though it's more restricted than regular whiskey that you can basically make Everclear and add caramel colors in that too, Scotch is more regulated. Same with Irish, same with Canadian. But with American bourbon whiskey, you have to distill at lower proofs. You have to age it in a certain container. With Scotch and Irish, you can age it in oak. But here it has to be brand new charred oak. So I'd argue that American whiskey is the most restricted whiskeys in the world.
And
On top of that, yeah.
We might be a little biased, but, you know.
And then on top of that, if you want to be bottled and bond, you have to be aged for a minimum of 4 years in the correct types of containers. You have to be bottled at exactly 100 proof. It has to be from one distillery, from one distilling season, from one. You must list the DSP, the distilled spirits producer number, premises number on the label. There's a lot of regulations. So it is the most restricted of the most restricted whiskeys in the world. So I hearken them to Boy Scouts earning badges.
Right.
Okay? You earn badges. There's Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Those are badges. Distilled by. Distilled by means that distillery made it. So whatever follows those two words, distilled by. So it doesn't say produced by. That doesn't mean that they made it. Distilled in Kentucky doesn't mean that they made it. But distilled by means they made it. That's a badge. Kentucky. We'll go from that. Whiskey.
Yeah.
Whiskey's a general badge. We're not vodka. We're whiskey, so we earn that badge. Straight is at least 2 years old. Okay, we earn that badge. Nothing but water added to it. Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Bourbon's not just rye whiskey or corn whiskey or blended whiskey. It's bourbon whiskey. It has certain restrictions. In Kentucky, don't have to tell you all. Mm-hmm. That's one of the most important things, too, because we have... we have the expertise. We have the Beams here. Our master distillers, part of the Beam family. So not everybody has Fred Noe and Jimmy Russell and Parker Beam and Craig Beam and all these people at their disposal. Not everybody else. So if you lived in another state, you can't just call your neighbor and say, "Hey, I'm having a problem with my doubler," and then, "Oh, why don't you just try that?" They do help each other out. You think that professional golfers are a small group of 150 to 200 people in the world.
Mm-hmm. It's even
master
smaller.
Distillers, 20 or 30, and it's in a real handful that have been around. So even a bigger deal. So we have that expertise. We also have the seasons so that the whiskey can go in and out of the barrels. So not everybody has extreme cold and extreme hot. I would joke with people, do you want Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey or Florida Straight Bourbon Whiskey?
Yeah.
So we all know the answer to that, but it's all hot. They're aging bourbon in Florida is going to be much, much different. It's going to take decades for them to figure out what's the optimal type of place to age it, elevation, all that good stuff. How much time?
Well, it was 28 degrees the other day. It's going to be 60 here on Saturday.
Right.
So.
Right.
That's quite dramatic.
I don't know if I want North Dakota Straight Bourbon Whiskey because that's all cold. We don't get a lot of heat, and the heat's a big deal. It's really what forces that whiskey in there. So, and I've heard y'all talking about this before, but they don't have the Busiks.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
In any other place in the world. So they're just going to put it in a warehouse, a real warehouse, in a warehouse on a pallet. Well, you need somebody who knows how to build those rick systems, and unless you live here in Kentucky and know the Busiks, you're not going to get that. Mm-hmm. So it's going to age different. So Kentucky means more than any other word on that label. Is more now, I think, means more now than it ever did.
I agree so with that, too.
So there you have badges. But if you put bottle and bond on top of it, it's got to be minimum of 4 years old, exactly 100 proof, from one distillery, from one distilling season. You have to list the distillery on the package. Wow. So I call that the Eagle Scout.
Yeah.
That's the Eagle Scout of whiskey and spirits. So why wouldn't you buy every one?
Yeah, I totally agree.
And start your collection there. So that's why I like bottle and bonds.
That's a very, very well in-depth way to really put it, I think. It's because, it's great. How many people have we had on the show that said that bottled and bond is, A, the best bang for your buck, and B, some of the best ones that are out there because you're not worried about lower proof. It's not too high proof, but it's really good. It's got that good balance to it as well.
And that's what the mixologists here in town, if you go down to Meta or if you go to Silver Dollar or to El Camino or 8 Up, you have these different programs that are built of making good cocktails. And they like the 100 proof because, like, if you're making a Manhattan, you're going to add a part of sweet vermouth, a couple dashes. You're going to put it on ice, stir it. That ice is actually a component of that drink because it's going to melt and turn into water. So if you start with 80 or 86 proof, that base spirit can sometimes disappear in that cocktail. But if you start with 100 proof, it stands up and you go, oh, this is a bourbon cocktail, or this is a rye cocktail, or this is, the base spirit's still there. So that's why the cocktail world also likes 100 proof, and they also like the history of it too.
Mm-hmm. So before we start digging into, I guess, maybe some of the brands and your actual job, you do a lot of research, just bourbon in general, right? I mean, you've got a lot of articles on your website. By the way, you want to plug your website real quick?
Sure. It's whiskeyprof.com.
There you go.
Like whiskey professor, but whiskeyprof.com.
So you do a lot of research. So is there like one thing that's always stood out to you as kind of like really fascinating, like something that you had you typically wouldn't have read unless you really dug down and found it?
I found Frederick Stitzel's diagram of a Rick system, of the Cheering Rick system, which I thought was just fascinating in 1879. I saw his, and that's another thing that separates everything that we do here in Kentucky a little bit different than, because they're all, I think that 95%, I think that's the number everybody goes with, of bourbon is made in Kentucky. I don't see that number falling, even with all these hundreds of different smaller distilleries. It's probably going to go up because Diageo is building their big plant. So, and there's another one going up in Bardstown. So that number might even go up because production, is high at those places. But I just think it's fascinating that, aging accounts for 50% minimum, about 50, for the rule of thumb. There's no strict number. Greg Davis taught me this, the distiller's rule of thumb. Greg Davis over at Maker's Mark. And that's the thing about being an ambassador or in this industry. If you don't, like I really am, I don't want to learn just because it's my job. It is fascinating, and I think it's really cool if you can be making a living off something that you think is fascinating, and then that I was a comedian, so I like being in front of people and talking. I get my thrills out of standing up in front of people and talking, so, and not every job can fill that void that most people wouldn't have. So I don't think I've ever given up stand-up comedy. I just do it to different crowds, and I'm talking about different things. And I try to use humor to throw in because it's kind of dry and technical when you talk about the making of bourbon.
It's always funny. I talk to my mom. She's like, "Yeah, once you've seen every distillery tour, once you've seen one, you've kind of seen them all, right? It's all the same process.
It's the same process.
It really is.
But it is fascinating how they all make it their own. If we all made the same thing, it'd be pretty boring. So it's a good thing that Four Roses only has single-story warehouses. It's cool that Maker's Mark only makes one recipe, and they do a little variations, but it still has that one recipe, and we make 5 recipes over here. So it's great that everybody has differences. But the rule of thumb is that 10% of the final flavor profile, which you're going to be doing, is going to come from your yeast strain. Mm-hmm. And then 15% is going to come from distillation. So whether you have a column still or a pot still or whatever, distillation, how much you bring that, how many, what proof you're bringing off the still, things like that. Then your fermentation, your small grains, that's 25%, but 50% is maturation. So if you have like our Elijah Craig 18 or 23-year-old, that number is going to go higher. Of that 50%, you're probably going to go into it because it's much more aged.
It's much more aged. A much different flavor profile to it.
So that's one, and he taught me that. I was like, man, now I can really see how that's going to affect my final product. So when I talk to distillers, I can keep that in mind too and see how that goes. I think it's really cool. So those couple things have been fascinating to me. The Stitzelweller diagram from 1879, and then finding little things out that. But I have these people at my disposal when I go to whiskey shows, and everybody else does too. When you have the Bourbon Classics and the Bourbon Affairs and the Bourbon Fests and different shows where these master distillers are, I really do go up and ask them all questions. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes I have one specific question for one thing, right? And I asked Denny Potter, one of our distillers, and Charlie Downs, another distiller who's worked with Earl Beam, Parker Beam, and Craig Beam. 3 generations of distillers he's worked with, and he's worked with 3 generations of our owners of the Shapira family. That's pretty. He's seen a lot. He's done a lot. So I ask these people because they're at my disposal. because I'm not an expert yet. You know, Jimmy
We're always learning.
Russell's an expert.
Yeah,
60
absolutely.
years. I've only been doing this 10 years. I'm not that huge of an expert, and I never claimed to be. But when I write these articles and I post things, I'm learning. Sister Mary Alma taught me in grade school the best way to learn about something is to write a book about it. So I wrote a book about bourbon, not to show off and say, hey, I'm an expert on bourbon. And I've said in my book, I'm learning too.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert yet.
That's how you have to do it, right?
We're not
But,
either.
yeah,
we
yeah.
try to host a podcast.
I mean,
we're
I'm
nobodies. We're nobodies.
I'm the brand ambassador.
We're not worthy.
I don't know how to make bourbon. I can tell you how it's made. I'm learning more all the time.
Yeah.
I'm learning more about the industry. But you know, I'm a face. I'm out there. I got to know these answers to the questions. I don't know the answer to every question, but turns out after you do this for a while, you become kind of an expert.
Yeah.
So I kind of am. But as long as I tell myself I'm not, then for me it takes kind of the pressure off. I'm not trying to not sell what I do. I mean, I think I'm pretty good at what I do, but it's like I want to be able to make
theory,
sure.
right? It's the imposter theory.
Yeah, I guess.
So let's talk about your face in front of people. So what's the? I know you're getting ready to leave to go to Europe here very soon. So kind of talk about what's the day in a life of Bernie and being a brand ambassador for Heaven Hill.
When you travel to different places, whether the United States or abroad, you usually are talking to different groups. So you're talking to your distributor partners, the people that actually sell your brands, to the bars and restaurants and that in whatever city that they're in. So they've got to have a different knowledge than the consumer or the mixologist or the buyer for that who's bringing that in. So you got to have three different talks right now. I gotta tell the salespeople how this compares with other competitors out there, because when I was over in Europe, great question I had. Why do I have Jim Beam and Jack Daniels? Why do I have to have Evan Williams on the back bar? Well, that's pretty elementary, and not just because hey, you need to buy our stuff.
Give us a 101. Why would you?
Well, the different ages and proofs, and that's where I bring up age and proof. I've always talked that age and proof is important. That's why I think Bottle and Bond, but a little bit higher proof. But those brands are 4-year-old 80 proof products. Evan Williams is a 5-year-old. It's not age stated, but it's a 5-year-old product. And then it is at 86 proof. So it's going to stand up a little bit more. Maybe not in a cocktail that, although one of my friends, he loves a Evan Williams Manhattan, but I would make an Manhattan with Evan Williams White Label, which is a Bottle and Bond product, and that's what I would make my Manhattan with. But another year of age is going to add a little bit more oomph, a little more barrel notes than, Evan Williams, remember, back in the day, used to be 7 years old, 90 proof. Then we had that pesky little fire and had to make some decisions because we lost 100,000 barrels. So that's a good entree to probably, when we talk about Elijah Craig later, what's happening there. Sometimes you don't have a choice on some of these things. So they had to make a choice. And they were going up against products that were 4-year-olds, 80 proof anyway, so they still made it a 5-year product and 86 proof. So there's a difference there. So there's a different flavor profile that you need to look at, and then there's price too.
Stay tuned for the next episode, where we dive into each of the Heaven Hill brands, as well as the removal of the Elijah Craig 12-year age statement. And it's also a Bourbon Pursuit first, where he actually breaks out the guitar for a solo performance. We'll see you on the next one.